TV live on have to go into it.
Hey, Paige and Lou.
Okay now?
I don't know.
Oh,
Can you hear us?
yes.
Yeah, my brother with his master's, he didn't qualify for funding, so he didn't get this.
Oh,
Because he's a little bit staggered. So
yeah.
So I think that put him off. Is that Marin supposed to come back?
I think Meg's gonna come back.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, Megan's coming back.
Yeah.
Okay.
Are you guys actually live? Oh,
We're not connected to YouTube yet.
okay.
Yeah, we're just on Zoom. Good question.
So-
Just because the top left, I was like,
Oh, yeah, we are on YouTube. Yeah.
we're live on YouTube and Zoom.
Yeah. So Paige and Lou, Paul's gonna introduce you and then we'll turn it over to you.
Let's turn it on again in a second.
Okay, sounds good.
Thanks for bearing with our technical challenges.
Yeah, no problem.
So I just kick it off the meeting.
Yep.
Yes.
That one's a little slow, but yeah. 2 minutes.
Yeah, they did a part of that and then over where the SRS in front of that one. So like.
Yep.
Welcome back. And now I want to introduce our next speakers. Paige Simon is a 19-year-old student at Lowell University in her second year studying social work. She grew up in Sault Ste. Marie and her grandparents are from Thessalon First Nation and Yapuntu First Nation, which is also known as Fort Hope. Lua Hafi is originally born in the Philippines, grew up in the GTA, and has lived in Thessalon for 6 years working within First Nations communities. She met Paige 12 summers ago, and the two have enjoyed many adventures together, but none quite as meaningful as Canoe for Every Child. Please welcome Paige Simon and Lou Mahaffey.
Hey everyone. So I'm Lou.
And I'm Paige. It's good to see you all, sort of. So we're just gonna jump right in. So I grew up, and my Gokum would teach me all about residential schools and the 60s scoop, and she always had a purpose of making sure I understood our history in Canada and what that meant for us as a family and people in our lives. But when everything with Kamloops came out and more residential schools started to discover more grave sites, the severity of what had transpired in Canada was something that I didn't even see coming. And a lot of people in my life that I have spent time with growing up just really don't recognize or understand how much residential schools have impacted our community and this country.
And I, as someone who is not First Nation, Inuit, or Métis, I never even learned about residential schools growing up. I'm 35 years old, and I was a history major at Laurentian University, and I even took Indigenous history courses. And I never once learned about the 60 scoop or residential schools or the mistreatment of the First Peoples. It was Thanksgiving and Hudson's Bay Company and stuff like that. It actually wasn't until I got a job working for Alberta's Future Leaders and was taken to a reserve out west in Alberta that I began to learn. And so many Canadians still to this day do not know very much at all. I remember in 2008 when Prime Minister Harper finally recognized what happened in the Indian residential schools. I remember the public apology. I watched it. I listened closely. But I remember as the years followed, feeling like, there was never a true follow-up response to that apology that said to the First Peoples that things were changing and that Canada was trustworthy. And as I began to recognize, all the things that have happened, it left me in a position of kind of asking the question, what do I do now? And that's actually what eventually led to me moving to Northern Ontario and working within First Nations communities. And that's how I met Paige. And then obviously, as she mentioned, when Kamloops happened, we were camping together, and I got out of the bush and heard that news and knew immediately that we wanted to do something. And I think being intentional about responding to the things that we feel on our heart is really, really important. And so glad that today is a day that where we recognize, we remember, we also take time to learn and respond to the history we're still just learning about within this country. And a significant part of our paddling journey was really about hearing the stories of survivors, their families, their communities, and remembering them. And we wanted to raise awareness of the not so distant past and the present challenges still facing Indigenous communities still to this day.
So we thought we should share some stories for you of what happened along our paddle. On Saturday, July 24th, we started out in the pouring rain. It was
torrential rain.
It was a difficult day to start. We thought about maybe postponing perhaps until it was a nicer day so that more people could be involved in our departure. However, we just felt that we wanted to start on our set date and that we should just power through. And that's what we did. It was a good start to the day, despite the weather challenges.
I think there's something to be said that when you know you're doing the right thing, even when there's some challenges, there's this joy and peace with doing the right thing. And we felt that throughout the whole day. Situations where we probably would have been annoyed before doing like paddling in the pouring rain and having to empty out the whole canoe multiple times because of all the water, still was like it was just a great feeling getting to do
definitely.
At one point, actually early on when we set out, we were passing by Shingwak Residential School and seeing it from the water, the river, it was pouring, keep in mind it's pouring rain, it's kind of foggy, it was this eerie kind of setting, and seeing the building from the river, it was actually, it hit my heart really hard, it hit both of us. It was kind of an eerie feeling to think that kids were taken even to the school by boat even. But that's how we set out, and going by that was kind of that initial like boost of like, this is why we're doing this. People need to know what's happened.
Later on in the day, as we were paddling through Garden River First Nation, we were coming up on this house that was on kind of like a bank, the bank of the river, and there was this huge blue tarp with a hose on the top of it, and there were all these little native kids just running and jumping and sliding down into the river. It was quite the sight to see, and we were looking, we were laughing, we thought it looked so fun and everything like that. And as we got closer, the family invited us to come up and spend some time with them. I guess the Bello family had been having their yearly family reunion, and they invited us to spend some time with them. They were truly so welcoming and so full of joy, but also along with how much fun we had when they were there, or when we were there, they shared with us some stories about their parents going to residential schools and their experience in day schools and whatnot, and how it was like growing up for them and how it affected them that their parents had gone to residential schools and whatnot. And we had some really meaningful conversations and made a great connection, I think, for that first day.
Yeah, I remember it was interesting just to hear how it affected their upbringing in even the smallest little ways. Like Mrs. Bello, she said that her mom used to buy more than they needed for food just to have it in case. And she said it was because when she was at the school, she was starving. And so they always would buy excess of stuff. And, you know, you don't really think about those things, but it's impacted them on so many different levels. The next day, we had a really long paddle to St. Joe's Island, and there was a little bit of a headwind at the end of that journey, but it was a really wonderful end to that day when we got to arrive at Springer and Doc's house, which is actually Sharon and Lori, a couple that opened up their home to us, cooked a meal for us, and wanted to sit down and talk. And we got to sleep in a real bed that night, which was so good.
That was a treat.
After
Yeah.
a pouring rain kind of night and day, everything was just drenched. We got to dry out some of our stuff. But as we sat and ate, they actually shared with us that when they were in school, they learned about residential schools, but it was portrayed as this positive thing to them, that their peers were going to school just like them, and they were learning English and being taught good things, and they never even knew that these horrible things were taking place. And Springer just shared that she felt like she had been so deceived and lied to, even as a Canadian, in that she had no idea this was happening, that children were being stripped from their families, that they were being robbed of their culture. And Paige got to share about her experience, and I also got to share, and it was such a wonderful time, and just again reinforced that we needed to be taking on this initiative.
Yeah. And I think for me, it was really meaningful to be with a white couple that evening and have them show their interest and their support and share how they felt about the situation and how they wanted to learn. I thought that was really special. And it was the opposite end of the first day, where we were learning from people and then we were teaching people. So I thought that was really cool.
Yeah. And then we got to Thessalon. Eventually, we stayed in Bruce Mines, but we had at this point, we had 2 different paddlers with us and joining us at different times, actually 4, because your brother and dad also came at the first day. But we arrived in Peace Park in Thessalon, and there was a few kayakers who greeted us, and then eventually one paddleboarder, and my dog was on the paddleboard, which was fun. And they came into Peace Park with us, and there was quite a crowd there, which just was actually kind of overwhelming, pulling in there. There were people from Thessalon First Nation and from the town of Thessalon who had come together to support us, to encourage us. But it was also just a reminder to us that this is what we need to be doing. We need to be coming together as humans and learning from the past, making changes for a better future. And it was just a really powerful moment of getting to visit with people and talk and share kind of what we'd experienced to that point.
Also, along the trip, after Thessalon, it got a little bit more dodgy. And I would like to say that we had some near-death experiences. Some might not think that. I am very aware of the fact that I'm dramatic. However, I don't think these are things to be taken lightly. So we wanted to share these stories with you.
So we left Thessalon. We had parked our canoe at Donna and James Orlando, who have been huge supporters, and they run the pharmacy in town and have been nothing but amazing to us in helping us make all this happen. And so we left, and Donna said goodbye to us as we set out. And as we were paddling, there was quite a strong headwind, so we knew it was going to be a tiring day. But in the far off distance, there was this tiny little dot, like just a dot.
Just a speck in the water.
And I said to Paige, I was like, Paige, we need to keep our eye on that dot. And I said, I think that's a freight ship that is coming in, and they port right in here at the docks. So we're going right across its path. We need to keep an eye on that.
And I was like, oh, like it's so far away. We're fine. It's going past us.
And I was like, Paige, those things move faster than we realize. And sure enough, within about 10 minutes, that dot became a ship. And that ship became ever so close to the point where some nervousness started to sink in a little bit inside of me, for sure. So at that point, I just basically told Paige, we got to paddle as hard as we can. We got to get across this bay to the islands on the other side. So we did.
We were booking it.
We probably exerted ourselves more in that hour and a half paddling just to get across than we had in some time. But the ship did get really close, and we ended up calling Donna, our savior again.
Our first responder.
And she called the docks to have them notify the ship that there's this little orange canoe bobbing around in the waves. And just to try and be aware, even if they wouldn't be able to necessarily stop. But we just made it within probably the span of 5 minutes of beating the ship in, which is not a lot of time. And it felt really good to be in a safe spot at that point.
Then we stopped and we watched it back into the port, which was kind of cool.
Yeah.
That same day, we went through Thessalon First Nation. We stopped there for a bit and we visited, and then we carried on along. We were kind of trying to stretch it. We had a big plan. We were trying to make it to a certain point that was kind of far away. And as it started to get into the late afternoon, evening time, it got a little bit more, there was much more of an overcast, and it started getting really windy. And so at a certain point, so the whole time we were canoeing like along the shore. We were out a bit, we were out a ways, but we were along the shore parallel, right? And that was kind of how we were doing it. But then these waves started coming in. We were in about 5 to 6 foot swells, and there was nowhere for us to go into shore because it was all trees, it was all rocks, but we couldn't keep going this way because the waves were coming in this way. So we had to keep paddling further and further out into these 5 and 6 foot waves. We did that for about an hour and a half. I was crying the entire time. I thought we were gonna die. And then eventually we had gotten to a point where we could turn around and catch the waves into this island. We made an emergency landing where we camped for the night, but that moment was pretty high stress.
Yeah, we surfed the wave in behind the island and got out, and I basically just hugged Paige, and I given her a little spiel actually on the water, like, if we tip, you leave this stuff, your life is more important. And I think that made it worse. But we made it. It was one of the challenges, but we did make it. And we had to clear some stuff on some trees on the island just to make room for us to put up a tent. But I was actually worried. The waves were so big. I was worried it was actually going to break over the island because the island wasn't very large, but we were okay.
It was a dinky little island we were on. It was a little bit sketchy.
Yeah. But I think by far the last night of our trip, I mean, at this point we've paddled almost how many kilometers?
A lot.
Yeah. It was 260.
260 was the total.
The total, yeah. So we had our last stretch left, which was maybe 15, 20 kilometers. And we got to Serpent River First Nation, and we had an incredible time there. Chief Brent and Councilmember Steve, they met us and shared some of their heart with us. And we set up our camp at the docks there, and we were getting ready for bed. And I was basically turning over in my sleeping bag. And as I turned, I saw a Muckwa black bear, and it was right there about 5 feet from our tent door. And he or she was walking down toward the water, towards our boat and our canoe. And I immediately was just like alarmed by how large it was. And we've had I've camped lots, and we've had black bears come through camp and stuff, but this was a very large black bear and very close to our tent. And so I, at that point, told Paige.
I called up the chief. I was like, come save us.
Let's get Chief Brent on the phone. He said in the case of any emergencies, if we needed something, to contact him. And I thought this might constitute. So I got the bear spray out, and kind of positioned Paige in a way where I thought I was protecting her by being by both the doors with my hands ready to shoot bear spray if needed, stick them out the doors real quick. And I started shouting and yelling at the bear to go. And there were some other variables at play that made me extra nervous about having a black bear on our site. And so the bear wouldn't leave. And at this point, Chief Brent's on the phone. Paige is panicking a little bit inside, but staying relatively composed. And the bear circled kind of our tent again. And then I kind of lost track of it. And it got quiet. And at that point, I heard this like grumbling kind of noise. And I kept asking Paige, is your stomach grumbling? And she wouldn't answer.
I didn't know. I was on the phone. I couldn't hear completely.
And then it got quiet for a second. And I realized at that moment with the light, the way the light turned, that the bear was actually right behind Paige on the other side of the tent. And I could see its like shadow, its silhouette. And I just tried to stay calm.
She didn't tell me.
No, I didn't want her to freak out. So yeah, it was around that time that eventually it started to kind of wander a bit, I think. And Chief Brent came and we just heard this wailing on the horn. And eventually the bear must have gone. And we grabbed as much of our stuff as we could from the tent and we went into his car and he took us to an elder's lodge to sleep on the floor of a building there. And I never felt so good about sleeping on a floor in that moment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It ended up all right.
It was
but
definitely.
That was also a high stress moment.
Yeah. One of the scariest and definitely not the way we wanted to end our trip. It was the last night. So we were like, I was like, we didn't paddle all this way to die by a black bear. So we kept going. But we did face other challenges that maybe weren't near death, but were just like things that we had to overcome on the journey. One of them just being the headwind. We paddled probably 3 or 4 days with just a strong headwind and the physical kind of exhaustion that comes in with that. And on top of it, rain and other things. There were moments where I felt fatigued. I'm much older than Paige, so she's young and healthy and alive, but I'm kind of old and decaying. So I felt it a little bit more, I think, personally at times. But truthfully, there were moments where stories that we heard just kind of would come flooding into my mind and in my heart as we would paddle. Being on the water, you just feel so connected with Mother Earth, and the water was basically speaking, and it would remind me just to keep going for so many reasons. But yeah, that was definitely something that was a daily battle, but also a daily victory too.
Another daily challenge that we faced along the journey was our sleeping situation. The first few nights we were lucky enough we were hosted a couple times here in Thessalon and then also on St. Joe's Island. But once we got past Thessalon, we were sleeping in the tent every night. And almost every single night that we slept in the tent, it did in fact rain, which was not lucky. And we found ourselves oftentimes waking up, puffy face, lips swollen from being sunburnt, just so exhausted, not the best sleep. And that was how we started our day. Not only that though, but sometimes it would be a thunderstorm. And sometimes we were like on an island, on a rock, on top of this island with no trees around, nothing to protect us. And you could like hear thunderstorms above you. It was a lot. Our sleeping situation was not the greatest. Yeah. And I love camping. I love sleeping in my tent, but doing the paddling every single day, like 30 kilometers, and then sleeping in a tent every single night, it was not the best situation, but we powered through.
I think probably the most daunting challenges was actually ourselves, and that being personal dynamics. I mean, you're battling yourself in your own situations, just being in this sort of a setting. But on top of it, we had to be with each other every day for
Yeah.
slipping for paddling. We were in close space.
And, lose a lot to deal with.
Yeah. And Paige is really dramatic. So
We've all got our faults here.
yeah. So it was something that we had to be intentional about working through every day, knowing how each other was feeling, knowing when we were annoying each other, and how to respond and react to each other. And then obviously we dealt with some pretty high stress situations, and that brings out other sides of us. And so through it all, I think that was just a really incredible learning experience, and it actually made us get closer as friends, which I'm so thankful for.
Definitely.
Yeah. Paige missed me after the trip.
Yeah, I had a little bit of separation anxiety.
Yeah. But yeah. Anyways, along the way though, yeah, there was our personal experiences of having, an eagle visit us every day that we were on the water. We had so many beautiful experiences with the nature all around us and then the people we met. But by far, it was getting to meet some of the beautiful people and hearing their stories, having them share their hearts with us, that just meant so much.
Yeah, so when we were in Blind River that morning, we had an elder from Mississauga, Maryland, that refused anything but a yes to her request to take us out for breakfast that morning. So we went to the 17 diner with her and another elder, Diane, who we had a wonderful visit with. They both told us stories about growing up Indigenous and whatnot. And Marilyn had actually gone to residential school. But a story that Diane told me that just really stuck with me, especially as somebody that presents outwardly white, was when she was a child and kids were getting taken away to residential schools. Her parents were obviously very scared about this circumstance. And they had made the decision to pack up their lives, and they moved to Chicago when she was quite young. And they basically told her, you never tell anybody that you're a Native. No one knows you look white. You can pass as white. And to stay safe and to protect yourself, you're going to hide this part of your identity. And as she started to grow up, it wasn't until she was an adult that she actually started telling people, yes, I'm Anishinaabe, and like, this is who I am on the inside, and this is where I come from. And that story really stuck with me.
Yeah, there were a lot of other stories that got shared, but we also received messages from people through our social media that was just a huge encouragement as they kind of shared their appreciation for us doing this. And one lady told us about her dad, who actually jumped off a boat that was taking him to the Spanish residential school, and he swam a little bit of Lake Huron and got to shore, and then he walked all the way back to Sault Ste. Marie. And I remember being on the lake with the swells and the craziness, and I was like, I can't imagine a little kid jumping off a boat into the water in order to get away from having to go to a school. Like, it just, those moments just hit you so hard. We got a story. I posted a story about an apple, and it was from when I toured the Mohawk residential school down south. They talked about a girl who had taken an apple, but then someone else sent us a message about how their mom would steal apples from doing the chores in the orchard and would put them in the mop buckets and hide them and then give them to the kids because they knew they were all starving. And that's how they helped each other. And that too, just like, there was a point where Donna and James brought us an apple and we got to eat some nice fruit and not just our dehydrated food. And it hits you. It hits you. And then Chief Brent, even when we were at Serpent River First Nation, he got us in the morning after our bear scare, and he gave us a tour of the community and shared from his heart with us, and it was so meaningful. But he actually talked to us about how they were under a boil water advisory because they didn't have clean water due to acid. There had been an acid plant put in the community by the Canadian government at one point, and it was gone, but it was still impacting their land and their water. And it was just crazy to me to think that just down the road from where
Mhm.
we live,
Yeah.
there were hundreds of people who had to boil their water before they could drink it. And it was the people living on a reserve, people who were Indigenous. And it broke my heart.
Yeah, when he told me that story, I was pretty taken aback because I just always understood it as an issue for flying communities, not an issue for somewhere that's like right near me. It was, yeah. So when Lou and I were first considering going on this journey, we had heard it said, if you want to show you care, then help us get clean drinking water.
Yeah, and essentially that's what we set out to try and do by paddling from Shingwak Residential School to Spanish Residential School, trying to raise awareness, but also to raise money to see sustainable clean drinking water come to Indigenous communities within Turtle Island in Canada. And truthfully, we didn't really make a big dent in that because the problem is so huge, which is honestly horrible to say. It's just a painful reality in Canada right now that needs to change. But we are so thankful for so many people who do want to help and who got behind this initiative and donated to the point where we were able to exceed the goal of $75,000 raised that goes towards Water First NGO, an Indigenous internship program to help train people to continue running the water plantation sites where clean water can be in the communities.
Oftentimes, we don't take action when we see injustices, and we just want to encourage everyone to take what you learn, respond to it, and seek to be a catalyst for change.
We hope that you have an incredible and meaningful Truth and Reconciliation Day today at Okomayu or wherever you're watching this from. And we just want to thank you so much for allowing us to share a little bit of our journey and experience with this.
Thanks so much, guys.
Thank you.
Miigwech.
Miigwech.
Next on our agenda is Telling Our Truths, Remembering the Children, presented by Dr. Paulette Steeves. Dr. Paulette Steeves, PhD, Cree-Métis, is an Indigenous archaeologist with a focus on the Pleistocene history of the Western Hemisphere. She received her BA Honors Cum Laude in 2000 at the University of Arkansas, Fayetteville. In 2008, Dr. Steeves was awarded the Clifford D. Clark Fellowship to attend graduate studies at Binghamton University in New York State, and was awarded her master's in anthropology in 2010 and doctorate in anthropology in 2015. During her doctoral studies, she worked with the Denver Museum of Nature and Science to carry out studies in the Great Plains on mammoth sites, which contain evidence of human technology on the mammoth bone, thus showing that humans were present in Nebraska over 18,000 years ago. Dr. Steeves has taught anthropology courses with a focus on Native American and First Nations histories and studies and decolonization of academia and knowledge production at Binghamton University, Selkirk College, Fort Peck Community College, the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, and Mount Allison University. She is currently an associate professor in sociology and anthropology here at Aloma University. Please welcome Dr. Paulette Steeves.
Tancy, thank you very much. Give me a second here to share my screen. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. So I want to talk a little bit today about the meaning of today and about the work that we have to do moving forward. So Indigenous communities have always known about genocide against their people in Canada. This is not news to us. We live daily with the memories of lost relations, languages, Mino Pimatsuwin, the good life, We live with the anguish of intergenerational trauma. Since the TRC Commission's final report was released in 2015, all Canadians have also had access to the stories of some residential school survivors in videos, films, and books, and in the records of the TRC Commission. They have been given some of the stories of those who did not survive, and many Canadians have expressed their shock and dismay at what they have learned. What people most often do not understand is that ongoing colonization and the ongoing impacts of genocide and residential schools on Indigenous communities. Some of that came to light this year. What Indigenous people have always known, that many children were buried in unmarked graves, came to the press and came to the general population. And now we ask, how long does it take to reclaim and recover our languages, to decolonize education, government, and people's minds, hearts, and souls? And how can we do the work needed to accomplish such a monumental task? Ongoing colonization and intergenerational trauma are serious, serious issues. High rates of suicide, alcohol and drug addiction, poverty and violence persist in many of our communities. I'm going to play you a brief video here. Just give me a second. This is a 4-minute video.
The story of our communities, people, and nation starts a long, long time ago. More than 60,000 years, in fact. This was when our culture and our law first started to thrive. We knew who we were and where we belonged. We took care of each other, our land, and our waters. We ate food that made us healthy, lived on country, and abided by our laws and song lines. Our families, our children were happy, with strong minds and hearts, because they were where they belonged. But then, everything changed.
Colonization came, bringing wars, disease, famine, violence, and the destruction and violation of our cultural laws, sacred sites, families, and communities.
We were denied our knowledge, language, ceremonies, and identity. The very things that tell us who we are and where we belong. And our connections with each other and the land grew weak.
And then, our children were taken from us. They had their names changed and their identities stripped away. They were told that Aboriginal people were bad. Worse still, they were told that their parents and grandparents did not want them.
For years this happened, and those children became known as the stolen generations.
Our children were denied love and experienced physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. This left very deep, very complex, and very real wounds, leaving scars that are still being felt personally, socially, spiritually, and collectively.
In the time when our story started, we were able to parent in the cultural way that has seen our families survive and thrive for generations. Our people were strong, and our culture flowed and healed us in times of hurt.
But since the trauma of colonization and the stolen generations, we have not been able to heal in the same way. And we have unknowingly passed this trauma on to our children through sharing our sad stories and having them witness and experience our pain. This is known as intergenerational trauma, and we see symptoms today in broken relationships, disconnected families, violence, suicide, and drug and alcohol abuse.
But this is not where our story ends. We still have strong minds and hearts, and we still know who we were and where we belong. By creating safe and strong communities together, supporting our families to be free from pain, returning to our culture and building a strength of identity, we can stop the cycle of trauma and bring about positive intergenerational change so that we can continue to thrive for the next 60,000 years. There are simple things that we can all do to help heal our trauma.
Visit healingfoundation.org.au to find out more.
Sorry, I don't know if you were seeing the video or seeing my PowerPoint. Okay, so ongoing colonization and intergenerational trauma are serious issues. And this is something that is a shame that is not ours. And silence is a major factor in blocking our paths to healing. So if you look at the statistics for Canada, there are so many places where First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people are not funded the same as the non-Indigenous population. And we need to find ways to end that. We need to find ways to get the funding up, to request the government put the funding up to equal all people in Canadian society. We need to address mental health. So we need to find ways towards healing. We must open spaces in every community in Canada, both on and off reservations, where survivors of residential schools and intergenerational trauma can get the community, medical, and professional support that they need to heal. So call to action 35 is stated as, we call upon the federal action to eliminate barriers to the creation of additional Aboriginal healing lodges within the federal correction system. We need more healing lodges and we need more treatment centers, not just treatment centers based on addictions or violence, treatment centers based on recovering from intergenerational trauma. So in Ontario today and in many places in Canada, you cannot get a family doctor, you cannot get a therapist. You wait in line for months or years for an appointment or a place in a recovery facility. The wait for service is even longer in isolated and northern communities that often have very limited to no services for mental health and healing. As students and as citizens, you can all work to make a difference, but you can only do this if you are aware of ongoing colonization and the social and political disparities Indigenous people face in Canada today. As the previous speakers talked about, they didn't know that the community just down the road had unsafe drinking water. There are many Indigenous communities in Canada today waiting to get facilities to have safe drinking water. So some Indigenous people have begun this work of reclaiming Mino Pimatsuin, the good life, the work of living the 7 grandfather teachings, the work of healing communities. Anishinaabe Mino Pimatsuin is a learning and teaching philosophy of how to live in a good way. Anishinaabe Mino Pimatsuin relates to the traditional teachings of the medicine wheel, which remind us to live in balance, mentally, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. Furthermore, there are 7 sacred teachings to help us understand Anishinaabe Mino Bimatsuwin. These relate to speaking the language, being or behaving, our ways of thinking, Anishinaabe ways of knowing, Anishinaabe ways of doing, relating to the spirit and spiritual, and Anishinaabe and all people's responsibilities to the land. The 7 grandfather teachings, as discussed by Benton Benai, Anishinaabe Ojibwe, Lacortes, from Lacortes, Orioles, Wisconsin, are wisdom, love, respect, bravery, honesty, humility, and truth. And there are many Indigenous elders and youth who have open paths to healing, who have provided strong examples of living the 7 grandfather teachings. Shirley Horn was sent at the age of 5 to St. John's Indian Residential School and at the age of 7 to Shinwalk Residential School. She returned to the site now renamed Algoma University in 2005 as a student on her own terms. Enrolling in Algoma University's Fine Arts program, she graduated with honors in 2009. She is an original co-founder of the Children of Shinwalk Alumni Association, formed in 1981. She became the first chancellor of Algoma University in 2015. That takes immense strength, wisdom, and courage to become a chancellor of a university housed in the same building where you were sent to residential school. Shirley Horn is an amazing example of strength for all people, an example of someone living Mino Bimatsuwin and the 7 grandfather teachings. So as we work to create paths to healing, we must remember to always speak the truth, to discuss the impacts of ongoing colonization and intergenerational trauma, and the need to press the government for spaces of healing, for equal funding for First Nations schools, for safe, clean drinking water for all communities, for healing facilities, for survivors of sexual assaults, violence, and addiction, for survivors of intergenerational trauma. Indigenous people lived a good life. They lived Mino Bimatsuwin prior to colonization, prior to genocide, prior to residential schools, where so many children suffered unspeakable violence and dehumanization. Now we seek to build paths to healing. It will take generations. But creating safe spaces for discussions of ongoing intergenerational trauma will facilitate healing processes. Colonization was like a giant whirling jigsaw, decimating First Nations families across decades of genocide. Now we search for shreds of jigsaw pieces to put ourselves, our families, and our communities back together into one coherent, well-formed picture. For many Indigenous people scattered to the winds by the forces of colonization, the work of reassembling identities, cultural practices, and families becomes a path to healing, to finding a way home. I'm going to play another little film here. I hope you'll get to see it. I'm not so good on my hyperlinks, but here we go.
My job is to make college easier because students have a lot.
Words, written by Melanie Florence, illustrated by Gabrielle Grimard. She came home from school today, skipping and dancing. humming a song under her breath, clutching a dream catcher she had made from odds and ends, bits of string, plastic beads, and brightly colored feathers. Her glossy braids danced against her shoulders, swaying with her, black as a raven's wing. "Grandpa?" she asked, clutching his hand, spinning under his arm before dropping it again. "How do you say grandfather in Cree?" He stopped breathing for a moment, a lifetime to a 7-year-old. He looked down at her sadly. "I don't remember," he answered. "I lost my words a long time ago." A frown clouded her face. "How do you lose words, Grandpa?" she asked. "They took them away," he answered. She thought for a moment. "Where did they take them?" she asked. "Where they took all of us," he said. "Away from home, away from laughter and soft words, away from our mothers who cried for us." She reached for his gnarled hand. "Who took you away, Grandpa?" she asked quietly. "Men and women dressed in black, talking to us with words we did not know," he answered. They reached home and sat on the stairs together. "Where did they take you, Grandpa?" she asked. "Away to a school that was cold and lonely, where angry white faces raised their voices and their hands when we used our words," he answered. "They took our words and locked them away, punished us until we forgot them, until we sounded like them. Harsh, sharp words, so different from the sound of our beautiful ones." She touched his weathered face, tried to wipe the sadness away with her soft hands. She looked down at her lap and handed him the dream catcher that she had made for her room. "You take this, Grandpa," she said. "Maybe it will help you find your words again." He smiled at her, his granddaughter, and touched her innocent face, a face that had never known hard words or raised hands. He smiled and kissed her head. The next day, she skipped out of school again, smiling widely at her grandfather. She stopped in front of him and took a deep breath. "Tancy nimasum," she said. His eyes widened. She smiled brighter than the sun. "I found your words, Grandpa," she said. She pulled a tattered, well-worn paperback out of her book bag. "Introduction to Cree," it said. "My teacher helped me find this for you at the library." He reached for it, his hands shaking, opened it, feeling the soft, much-loved pages under his fingers. "Nusisum," he whispered. "Granddaughter." The word felt familiar in his mouth. It felt like his home, his mother. He turned the pages of the book carefully. "Masinaigan," book. He turned another, word after word. "Pikisquewin," language. His words, pages and pages of them. He looked at his granddaughter, his Nusisum. "Thank you. Teenki," he said. "Will you read to me?" she asked. taking his hand in hers and leading him home. Will you teach me your words? His heart danced as he nodded, holding the book against his chest. From 1831 to 1996, the Government of Canada took First Nations children away from their families and sent them to residential schools. The government and the white men and women who taught at these schools were prejudiced. They believed that white people were better than First Nations or Indigenous people. The children were forbidden to speak their own language and were forced to speak only English. Because of this cruel practice, many, many children suffered. Many, many families were torn apart, and much of the rich, beautiful Indigenous culture was lost. A culture full of wisdom we all desperately need.
I have a challenge for all of you. Go to every
Hang on a
computer in your
minute.
house, your mom's, your dad's, your sister, your brother's computer, and install Honey. Wait, Mom, before you check out, do you have Honey installed?
What's honey?
Oh, no. It's a free
Sorry.
browser add-on that automatically applies coupon codes when you check out online.
So what's the catch?
There is no catch. My mom wants to buy these 3 jackets online. They cost $639. Before you check out, Mom, can you just open a new tab and then type in joinhoney.com? Now just click add to Chrome. Perfect. Now hit apply coupon code. Give Honey 5 seconds and boom, it found a coupon code for $221. We're literally about to check out without Honey. That is a sin. Install Honey. It's free and only takes 2 clicks to install. There's no reason not to go to joinhoney.com.
Sorry about that. So, as we honor the children who never came home and we search for the children, keep Mino Pimatsuin in your hearts. Turn grief and sadness into actions that create paths to healing. Work to create safe spaces for healing. Relearn Indigenous languages, become a part of putting the pieces of our beautiful ways of knowing, being, and doing back together. Many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people and communities have begun this work. People are making language programs available online, and they are sharing their stories and writing books. Search for and reclaim Mino Pimatsuin. Do not blame others for their actions. Remember, many of our relations are suffering from ongoing intergenerational trauma and do not have safe spaces for healing or recovery. It is everyone's job to become informed of the impacts of colonization, genocide, and intergenerational trauma, to work to create safe spaces for healing. No one chooses to be born into intergenerational trauma. No child chooses to become an abuser or alcoholic with addictions living in poverty. This was brought to our nations by colonizers. It is a sickness that has often been undiscussed and untreated for hundreds of years. It will take generations to heal, but we can all be a part of creating healing and spaces and services for healing. Remember to hold Mino Pimatsuin close to your hearts and follow a good path of the 7 grandfather teachings. Sorry.
Just a second.
Sorry, we have the technical difficulty. We're just gonna figure out. Thank you. Dr. Steves, if you can also share those links with us and we can communicate that out to the viewing audience a little bit later on. We really appreciate that. Miigwech again. Our next speaker, Shirley Horn, should be joining us momentarily, but we also wanted to invite those of you who are in Sault Ste. Marie or on campus to our Walk to the Water. It's going to happen from Shinwalk Hall, the front steps, all the way down to Bellevue Park, down to the water, and then we're going to come back, and that will conclude our festivities. However, we'll wait for a few more minutes before Shirley gets here, and we will resume in about 5 minutes' time. Miigwech.